Hello and welcome to the interview. The Islamic State group has been losing ground in Syria and Iraq, but as recent events in Britain and France have shown, its appeal to some young Muslims hasn't gone away. The doctrine of the army of one is still leading individual French or British citizens to commit or to attempt atrocities in their home countries. My guest today argues that the way to counter ISIS is to deconstruct its language and its assumptions. Myriam Benraad has published L'État islamique pris au mot, which roughly translates as capturing the Islamic State's words. Welcome to the program,
Thank you.
Myriam. So I understand you're preparing the English version
Yes.
Of this book. Of course, the language of ISIS, and particularly its recruitment language, has been analysed for several years. Why dedicate a book specifically to this in 2017?
There were many books published in 2014, 15, 16, but very few of them addressed the question of the language, the rhetoric, and how this same language builds a vision of the world and sells a vision of the world to a number of individuals across the world, and as has been a key tool regarding the recruitment of thousands of people, which is less the case today, as they are losing their territory, their so-called caliphate across Iraq and Syria, but they're still appealing to some people, especially in European societies. And as you've just said, we can see it clearly with the multiplication of attacks, or attacks at least inspired by the Islamic State. Beyond the fact that some of these people had no direct links with militants in the Middle East. So I believe that we have to indeed work much more on the language, on the ideology of this group, and jihadism more broadly. This isn't actually exclusively on the Islamic State. It's a reflection on jihadism and how to counter it on the rhetoric side.
Before we come to how to counter this language, is there a particularly good example you can give us of how the group distorts a particular word or phrase from the Islamic tradition?
Well, first, this vision of the world is a binary one. It's based on the us versus them principle, which we've seen very clearly recently with the attacks targeting people in Manchester, in London, but we've also seen it over the last few days, for instance, with the Finsbury attack. So the rhetoric of the Islamic State has become somehow indirectly the rhetoric of its so-called enemies, with this anti-Muslim, totalizing anti-Muslim discourse, which is the one of some of these people. I'm also mentioning. I would like also to mention here. Sorry, the attack in Canada. Attacks against mosques. So we have a parallel that is clear. Just to give you an example, or a few examples, the classic, I would say the ordinary dichotomy on which they play between the Orient, the West and the East, the Orient and the Occident. So there is a very strong Occidentalist discourse, which is the mirror of Orientalism. At the same time, they are also self-orientalizing. We've seen this with some of the militants, how they, for instance, wanted to transform their appearance or look like, speaking about the traditional, or I would say fighters of the origins, the first Muslims. There's also one dichotomy that I address in this book, which regards the opposition between, for instance, the jihad and the Crusades, Islam and miscreants, etc. This book is about dichotomies, but just to through these binary categories, my intention was to show to what extent this group is able to, as I said, to propose a simplified approach to world affairs.
Why has it managed to sell this better than other jihadist groups? Because after all, these binary oppositions, Islamic State group doesn't have a monopoly on that. When you talk about, for example, us and them, the West and us, that was used, for example, by Said Qutb, who was one of the theorists that Al-Qaeda liked, particularly the idea of a decadent West and a pure Muslim nation. All these things are not new. I suppose what you would argue is that in this book, and you talk about this a lot, is the packaging uses the geek culture of today, which makes it attractive to young people who don't actually have Muslim learning, but who do understand social media and things like that?
Well, I would say there was an upgrading with the Islamic State, because you're mentioning Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda was actually very appealing at the time. Let's be cautious about not rewriting history. Al-Qaeda had very significant appeal at its time, but was restrained, limited to very, I would say, traditional militant circles, especially because of its use of classical Arabic and no other language. On the contrary, the Islamic State resorts to a multilingual package, communication, so you can have access to their communiques, videos, or radio shows in all languages, which is, of course, a major factor of amplification of the message and of the recruitment capacity. So I would say this is one factor. The other factor is the sophistication of its propaganda, which makes it, by the way, very Western or very Westernized. Some of their videos look like Hollywood blockbusters, or they're great productions. They're also using the pop culture, the video game culture. It's a very hybrid movement, which makes it very complex. But once again, the rhetoric, the message, the simplified vision it offers, conveyed by a hyper-modern, hyper-sophisticated propaganda machine.
In terms of countering all this, though, I mean, it's all very well to deconstruct this discourse in a book and to explain how the historical revisionism doesn't actually reflect what really happened in history. A young person who's basically given up on society doesn't understand that. They're not going to be reading this. So how does counter-messaging even look like in this context?
Well, I don't think it should be limited to the internet, because, of course, counter-messaging is a strategy, for instance, used by the US. It's been used for years, trying to develop counter-messages, counter-narratives, trying to occupy the space, the online space in particular, so to reduce the exposure of Islamist jihadist propaganda. This isn't enough. Speaking about our societies, I think this also has to translate into educational programs, or making this deconstruction, more accessible through, for instance, speaking about the youth, education, training, having courses, specific courses in high schools or even secondary schools regarding jihadism and the fact that it's a trap. It's also, I was mentioning hypermodernity. Of course, these young people are also somehow the children of their time, very much online, sometimes, as you're saying, not quite connected with their families, or looking for a tradition which they don't find in ordinary environments, including some mosques, looking for a revolutionary cause, thinking that this, once again, binary ideology, vision of the world will sort of allow them to be true Muslims, or to be true anti-system people, to be true revolutionaries. All of these factors have to be taken into considerations. But I really do believe, once again, in education.
Well, if I want to explore that a bit more. I mean, if education is the key, as far as you're concerned, does that mean accepting that in the French context, there has to be a recognition that something has gone wrong with the integration of a certain generation of Muslims in France? And does this involve a real sea change in the way the state and the authorities approach this whole issue?
Well, I think this has to be nuanced. I wouldn't say an entire generation is concerned. Still, the jihadists form a minority. There were several hundreds in Syria, between Syria and Iraq, but they're still a minority, including Salafists. I think a number of issues have to be addressed yet. For instance, one that I address as well is the colonial question. How do we deal with coloniality, post-coloniality? All of these things need, of course, especially in a French context, to be addressed, because the anti-colonial message of the Islamic State has been objectively a factor of recruitment, especially among the French youth. But it's, of course, as I said, a very caricatural message which did not, well, first, which does not correspond to history, and second, which has a very deleterious impact on these people. So we have to work upstream.
You remember when President Macron was only a candidate, he caused a stir by talking about colonialism as a crime when he went to Algeria. Do you think that will have turned out to be simply campaign talk, or does that signal some kind of change in the way France is willing to look at this?
I don't see any structural change. I mean, I think this has to be once again addressed in the public space, in schools, and where it matters, because in this case it was, of course, a statement made during a very specific moment, which is the electoral campaign. And well, it's very symbolic, of course, for the Algerians and for the French-Algerian relationship more generally, but it won't have any impact, genuine impact on what we've just discussed about, which is basically how to contain the spread of jihadism, how to make sure that jihadism doesn't become the mainstream way of thinking among a number of young Muslims or other individuals in France.
We'll have to end it there. We've run out of time. Thank you so much, Myriam Benraad, lecturer in political science at the University of Limerick in Ireland. That's all for this edition of The Interview. More news coming up on France 24.
What do you want from your news website? France24.com, giving you easier access to information and faster for a unique experience. France24.com, the international news website.